Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing today? Let's give a hand for everybody who's presented so far at this conference. Day one was awesome, wasn't it? We've heard some fabulous things about culture, about how theater can help us in life, right? It's just been a great group of speakers. I had the pleasure of meeting a lot of the speakers last night at the dinner, and there's just a lot of really talented individuals out there who can tell you everything you need to know about Agile, and they can tell you the difference between CSM and PSM, but don't ask me to answer those questions. Talk to one of those professional coaches. My name is Cindy Casebolt. I am currently the strategic PMO leader, the enterprise PMO leader for CAS. I'll talk a little bit about CAS in a few minutes. My background is not in professional Agile coaching. I have been a Scrum practitioner. I've run several standing teams. I've also been in technology and PMO leadership positions where I was responsible and or accountable for leading and supporting Agile transformations. So a lot of what I'm going to talk with you about today is really just practical experience, although it was informed by the greats who speak about Agile transformations, such as Mike Cohn and his ADAPT process. I've taken a look at all of those things as we were building our transformations and making sure that we were aligning to them, and then basically proving out that those models do work. So I'm just going to give you some real talk about some things I've experienced, some things I've learned, some mistakes we've made, and hopefully as you move forward in your transformations in your organizations, you can avoid some of the challenges that we dealt with by my presentation today. So I'll start with a story. My husband and I really enjoy going out to this Chinese restaurant that's just near our house. Our neighbors actually own it. And now that we're empty nesters, we have to figure out how to discover our relationship with each other again. And I think the best thing about going to a Chinese restaurant is at the very end, when you get the fortune cookie, and then you read the fortune. And I was there a few weeks ago, and whoever puts the fortunes in these fortune cookies really has a sense of humor, I believe. They're not exactly fortunes. Some of them are kind of like Zen riddles. And the one I read a couple of weeks ago said, is a tortoise without his shell naked or homeless? So I said, okay, I'm not sure how to apply that to my life. But it made me think, humor is really about a mindset change, right? Here's our tortoise trying to figure out what to do with that information, right? But humor is really about a mindset change. You have a set of assumptions, and you walk into this joke, unknowingly, and you're walking through this joke, you're listening to it, and then all of a sudden there's a shift, an abrupt shift, and it causes humor. So the best humor is not an easy thing to do. It takes a lot of intelligence to be humorous. My daughter is actually a theater major, and timing and humor, very, very difficult thing to do because you have to get that mindset change just right. Similarly, when you're doing an Agile transformation, the mindset change has to be absolutely right. You must start with the mindset change. This image is really appealing to me because it shows on the left someone whose mind is not open yet, and then a mind that can explode with opportunity. We need the minds on the right in order to enable a transformation with everybody in the organization. This slide I can't take credit for, but I am thrilled with the simplicity of it. Ahmed put this together, and it was recently published in a Forbes Now and an HBR article online about Agile at scale. But the simplicity of it is amazing because really this is what we need to think about. We have to work from left to right with an Agile transformation. We must begin with the mindset. So many organizations that I'm going to show you a few examples of today, so many get hung up in the mechanics or the unlimited set of practices there on the right and don't focus enough on the left. Because the mindset and the values are so important, I'm going to recite them to you. I'm not going to recite a lot to you in this presentation, but these are so valuable that we need to make sure that we all agree that they make sense. Respect for people and culture. The concept of flow, optimizing continuous, sustainable throughput of value. Innovation, make sure we have customer validation of our innovation, but that we practice innovation accounting, and that we know that when we move forward with a project, that it's okay for us to pivot without guilt. And the concept of Kaizen, which some people think is actually stands for continuous improvement, but I've been told that the true translation of that is relentless improvement. So optimizing the whole with systems thinking and making sure that you're focused on that relentless improvement. And then, of course, we get into the 4 values. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. Now, I'm not going to read the 12 principles to you, but I'm sure you're all familiar with those. It begins with our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. And it ends with the 12th principle that talks to continuous improvement as well. So again, too many transformations get hung up on the right side, all of those principles. We need to explore a couple of examples of that and how we could right the ship to get to where we needed to go. But first, I have to talk about this guy, because I always talk about this guy. This is where it all began. William Edwards Deming was credited, or is credited, for the Japanese post-war economic miracle of the 50s and 60s, rising from the ashes after World War II and restructuring, refactoring all of those factories so that Japan became the 2nd largest economy in the world through the principles that they followed from Deming. Well, Deming knew Agile. He didn't call it Agile. He was the predecessor of Six Sigma, Lean and Agile. But he knows it begins with the people. And he knows that we can't blame the people. People are assets for us. He says people are already doing their best. The problems are with the system. Only management can change the system. So what does that mean? As practitioners, as technology leaders, as PMO leaders, as practice leaders, as coaches, the responsibility is with us to help change the system and to enable their success. People are our assets. Who can tell me what this picture is? Most people from this room, I'm sure, are from Ohio. Cleveland Browns. Okay, great. Can you tell me more about the Cleveland Browns? What was going on here? They didn't do very well last year. Right. So, January 6, 2018, the Cleveland Browns held a perfect season parade to thank their fans, to thank their loyal fans, and kind of to apologize too. What I love about this, when I read it, I said, oh my gosh, that's an Agile value. Celebrate failure. Celebrate failure. They probably don't even know what Agile is. In their world, they don't need to know, right? But this is a great example of the fact that when you try and you fail, they certainly tried. They tried. When you try and you fail, you realize you've got to get up and you've got to try again. And you've got to respect that, and you've got to make it safe. You've got to create that psychological safety that it's okay to fail as long as we're learning by doing. I'm going to talk about 3 main themes for transformation today. The first one is make it your own. The second one is build the community. And the third one is pay it forward. So in Make It Your Own, I found this image of a few models, and I found it really interesting because when we talk about Agile, so many folks still refer to it as a methodology. Agile is not a methodology. Agile is a framework, just like these models are frameworks. So we need to respect the framework. We need to start with the framework. We need to make sure that we have a framework that begins the process, that we've been informed by some best practices. And the concept of COHAA, which many of you I'm sure are very familiar, but I'll go through this quickly, is very, very important for any transformation. Because what we're saying is, when we begin to learn something, we don't know what we don't know. We have conscious incompetence, right? We have to follow step by step so that we can succeed. So in the example of a stand-up, for example, a stand-up ceremony, with SHU, you'll hear the common phrase, okay team, we're going to meet for 15 minutes, no more than 15 minutes. we're not going to sit down in our chairs because we need to be fast. And we're going to go around the room and you can only say 3 things. You can say what you did yesterday, what you're going to do today, and what blockers you have. Now, is that the only way to do a stand-up? Absolutely not. But that gets the discipline started with the individuals to recognize this is not a status meeting. This is not a meeting where we resolve problems. This is not a meeting where we talk in detail about one of the story cards that we're working on this sprint. It is an update. It's an opportunity for the team to get alignment for the plan for the day and to understand what problems there are so that the Scrum Master or the product owner and others can help remove those blockers as soon as possible during the day and get them back on track again. When you move to COHAA, you have a little bit of experience and you're starting to test some of those boundaries. You understand the roles and you understand the boundaries and the value of doing a stand-up, but you're starting to realize, how do I make it better? How do I make it more valuable for my team? So we see some organizations, I've seen some of my teams that started with that basic construct, and then they move to, well, what if we go to reviewing the card wall every other day, and we talk from the card wall, whether that's our Jira board that we project on the wall or it's a physical board, it doesn't matter. We talk through those cards and we understand what everybody's working on and what their challenges are. Well, that's a little bit of an innovation, but it helps the team stay on track. And that team alternated between going through the card wall one day and then the next day they were doing the one thing I did yesterday, one thing I'm doing today, and what blockers I have. Re is when you have gotten to the point that everyone really understands the core principles of what you're doing with that practice and you can innovate beyond what you need. So the team structure, the stand-up, could vacillate between many different things. As long as the team recognizes that it's short, it's quick, it's an opportunity to align, bring blockers up, pull up the card wall if you need to, or just bring up whatever the topic is that needs to be discussed so that the team can move forward for the day and be productive. So again, it's very important to start with the shoe. A lot of the things I'm going to be talking about today is how the community works together to build a transformation, but you have to make sure that you have a way to gain that knowledge by embedding some coaches. In both of these examples I'm going to walk through, we had coaches that were not only dedicated to leading teams, so they had to be Scrum Masters in their day job, but they were also coaching individuals and teams and other Scrum Masters. Now, the number of coaches that you may need is going to vary based on the expertise of the other individuals on the other teams. In the cases that I'll be walking through today, we had 2 or 3 coaches for a team of 10 Scrum Masters, but that's because those Scrum Masters were transitioning from being traditional project managers or traditional application development managers or traditional resource managers and learning how to be Scrum Masters. So the coaches had to help those Scrum Masters be better at Scrum and teach them how to be better coaches and leaders of their teams as well in this new model that they were learning. So this very first example we're going to call Harvest Agile. And this was a company that I walked in and I was talking with the CIO, and he was very excited because he said, we are doing Agile everywhere. We have all kinds of Agile practices going on. We've brought in several different vendors from several different companies, and we've got all kinds of really successful practices happening. I said, well, that's wonderful. Let's just pull a bunch of people together and let's have basically a planning session. Let's do an iteration 0. Let's pull all of these groups together and talk about different themes and talk about what practices that they've been able to harvest and use effectively. So as part of that discovery process, I really was trying to understand how much Agile is really happening and how much does it fit, how much is SHU, how much is HA, how much is RE, and did they go to RE before they started with SHU? Where are we, and where are we actually succeeding in this Agile transformation? So the Harvest Agile mission and vision was created for a group of people. And the people chosen were from every area of the organization. So there were quite a few technologists of different roles. There were folks from the PMO, so we had both BAs and project managers. We also had several individuals from the business side who were advocates. They were product owners, maybe they were project sponsors, but they were advocates for Agile practices and Agile projects because they were able to gain some successes and they wanted to share what they had learned and make sure that other parts of the company can succeed as well. So we had 3 main things that we wanted to do. We wanted to extend our initial successes because we had several teams that were successfully delivering. And again, we had big sponsorship with certain product owners and product managers on the business side, and that was pretty key. So what was making those bright spots bright? What was making those parts of the organization successful? So we wanted to create these guardrails so that we could have other teams that wanted to get started. There were other business lines that hadn't done any Agile practices, hadn't set up any Agile teams yet. What do they need to know? What can they learn from the teams that have already succeeded? And then what learning methods and communities do we need? What information, what tools, what training do we need in order for those teams to be successful? Do we need to talk about outside training? Do we need to do some internal training? Do we need to seed those teams with some experts from other teams in order to get them jump-started? That's what the second initiative, part of the initiative was for. And then the third was to have this consistency in our approach to Agile, allowing those teams to innovate where they needed to and to do what was best for their project and their team and their technology, but creating those guardrails that were unique to that organization that everyone could align to. So some of the things that they decided to do were to, just a second. They were to work with 6 different constructs. So what we did is we divided those teams into 6 different problems we were trying to solve. We met with the team initially for a couple hours, and we said, these are the themes that we would like for you to sign up for. So it was kind of like having cards on the wall, and it was a poll model. So the folks on the team decided they were going to choose what they wanted to be a part of. We knew that we didn't have a common glossary or key practices because we had several different vendors that had come in and come out with different ways of teaching Scrum and XP and Agile and Wagile and Scrum or Fall and everything in between. And in some departments there were individuals who just read a book. And I mean, I applaud that. They want to learn, they want to grow, but they hadn't had any real experience in doing Agile. So we needed that common glossary and a common set of key practices. The organization had decided that they didn't want everything to be Agile. They wanted to be able to assess projects and determine in the initiate phase, as they were choosing a methodology, whether Agile or Waterfall made more sense. There was one team or one floor that had moved very radically from typical offices with walls to a new space configuration that was very, very radical. It was Silicon Valley radical. It was Fuse by Cardinal Health radical. It was Forage radical, okay? But these folks had been sitting in typical offices for 30 years with a typical manager that told them what to do every day, and then at the end of the day they reported back on what they got done. So it was a radical change, and it was difficult for some folks. So we needed to take a step back from that and have a team of people make a recommendation, working with facilities on what the space should be like. Eventually, we needed to get to how did we create a community for knowledge sharing? What was our training recommendation? And last but not least, the tools. The tools are last. You can do everything with the processes and the people and the community without a tool. You can do it with a Excel. You can do it with a physical board. I think you guys all know this. A fool with a tool is still a fool, as Maria Urani, who's the CIO at NetJets, will say. But she's right. The tool is not going to be your transformation. The tool is at the tail end of the transformation. So these were the 6 themes that they worked on. The key practices group was working on the shoe. Okay? They worked with individuals throughout the organization who maybe had brought some resident knowledge from somewhere else as to how these practices should be done. They had gained some learnings as to how it was successful at this company, and they were talking amongst each other to define what it is, use a common nomenclature for it, what is its purpose, what are the minimum standards to be doing the practice well, and if you're optimizing those practices, what will that look like? So we created this book, and I mean, many of you have been here in Columbus for a long time. There are other organizations. Lean Dog has their book. Nationwide started with the Agile Tea Leaves. This was this company's personal book. They defined 28 key practices, and again, they based it on what existed in key practices in the industry. They didn't do it in a vacuum. They did it outside of their walls as well as within. And another thing that was very interesting is they identified a core 11 of those 28 practices to say, if you are striving or doing these 11 practices, and most of them were around collaboration, if you are doing these core practices, then you can be considered an Agile team. Well, why was that important in this construct? It was important because we had said earlier that they were not looking to have every project be Agile. They were going to determine the suitability of a project and then determine if they wanted to move forward with an Agile approach. So some teams had started with some Agile practices, or they called themselves Agile, but they were not succeeding. And one of the things we had to do was protect the brand of Agile. We had to protect the fact that, hey, Agile will work if you do certain things right, if you follow the shoe, if you have the constructs that you need. But the practices work together. They work optimally together. And we had some teams that had tried and failed pretty strongly, and we had some business partners that said, I am never going with an Agile approach because I just got off of that billing project and oh my gosh, never again, never again. So we really had to define what teams were really striving for Agile. That being said, of the 28 practices, we indicated that any team could choose to use any of the 28 practices, may or may not be considered full Agile, but if they could get some benefit from collaboration, they should use them. Any team can do a stand-up. A support team can do a stand-up. Any team can have a big visible chart. Maybe it's a Kanban wall because they really can't determine what's coming in and what's flowing out and what work they're going to be working on at a certain period of time, but they can certainly use that to visualize their flow. So we recognize that our community is willing to help any team and meet their need in whatever way that we could, whether they were going full on Agile or whether they just wanted to use some of the practices to improve their collaboration. The suitability tool. Actually, have to give credit to Grange Insurance because that was the team that put this together. Ohio State University's Fisher College of Business, the graduate program, there was a professor there who became very interested in this tool and actually pitched this model to Harvard Business Review. It didn't make the final cut to be an article, but I think it's notable to say that this tool was very well regarded by the team, the academics outside of Grange Insurance because of what a great job this team did. They took a lot of things into account. They looked at the environment of the team. They asked questions about the environment in which the team was working, whether they were co-located, whether they were in various parts of the country, how many people had experience with Agile, what technology was going to be used, what dependencies there were with business processes and different other technologies or systems that maybe weren't managed by the core team. How much were the requirements expected to change? What sponsor support would they give? Would they be able to have a full-time person to play a product owner and to co-locate with them? And what investment was going to be made for this project? Is this project going to be multi-year or is it just going to be for a few months? If the team needs that coaching support, then we need to be able to make that investment to bring those members either internally or externally to support that team. And these are just, I know you can't read this. My email is at the end of this. If you would like a copy of this suitability tool, you can email me and I will send it to you. But just a couple call outs. Their team is enthusiastic to work in a collaborative Agile environment. That's important, right? Got to make sure the team is motivated because personal change is hard. And they're going to be changing the way that they're typically doing things. So that was our suitability tool. The space recommendation. So as I mentioned, there was a lot of concern because it was too drastic of a change for an organization that had been in place for so many years and some people who had worked in traditional environments for over 30 years. We used the Agile values of respecting the people and respecting their thoughts and their ideas, and we actually put a team of people working with the facilities department to plan out some models that enabled both the team collaboration, as you can see on the left, because there were pods of people that definitely there were plenty of workspace, but they also were within earshot of each other and they could turn around and talk with each other. And also a war room or a collaboration room where they could go off and have separate discussions if they needed to do so. For example, if they were doing a 3 Amigo, they didn't want to disturb the other developers who weren't a part of that 3 Amigo, they could go off into the war room and do that. So that was our case study 1. Case study 2, I'm going to talk a little more about building the community. This company was very, very different from the first company I talked to you about. Whereas the first company was a very traditional culture, I think you know now is Grange Insurance because I told you they authored the Suitability tool. Traditional culture, somewhat slow-moving initially, but had to pick up the pace because they were starting to face competition and needed to pivot their business model from one product to another. So there was quite a bit of transformation on many ways that was happening over time for the 75-year company. This company that I'm going to talk to you about next really acted and still acts very much like a startup, even though they've been around about 50 years. Very, very fast-moving business model. Pivots a lot. Definitely the culture aspects of fail fast, fail often was not a problem in this culture. People were very accustomed to pivoting. Whether they were actually getting the value out of some of the things they were pivoting to was more of the challenge there. I walked in on my first day. The entire technology department was with Agile seating. Everybody was in an open space. There were huddle rooms, there were daily stand-ups going on, there were physical card walls everywhere I looked. And I actually was handed this on my very first day, and it was known as the Placemat. And it was literally the size of a placemat that you would eat your lunch on, and it was laminated, and everybody had one, and it was sitting on the desk. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. Look at this stuff. It tells you how to set up the board. It tells you all the practices. It tells you the outcome. It tells you how long the practices should be. It tells you the cadence in which they should happen. This is absolutely incredible. When do I get started? So I went and I met with my team. And I said, have you seen the Placemat? Yeah. Nobody uses that. Somebody made that up 2 or 3 years ago, and we don't even really know what it's for. We just kind of do our own thing. Most people really here aren't even doing Agile. So I said, okay, what's the story here? Because I looked this over, and there's actually a flip side to it, too, that actually talked about metrics, and I thought this was very well thought out. So I did a little research. There was a couple of external coaching firms or Agile firms that helped 3 or 4 years ago, but it was largely 3 or 4 people who were native to that company that got in a room and they spent 3 or 4 days and they built this out. And they said, this is how we're going to do Agile. Now, like I said, very smart people. All of this makes sense. They developed a training program from that. Shortly thereafter, the person who was the main coach and advocate for all of these practices, he was here on a visa, and his visa expired, and he had to go back home. So what do you think happened to the Agile transformation? Gone, right? So because all of that mind share happened with just a few people, and they weren't staying in that role to see it through, or those roles to see it through, it kind of died on the vine. So I began to work with my leader and my peers in our app development space, and we had a goal. We set a goal with top-down support, which is very important. You've got to have that top-down support to reinvigorate our Agile practices. And we called that Agile Maturity because we didn't want anybody to feel that if they were living some of the mechanics of it, or if some of them were truly doing Agile, we weren't discrediting that. We were like, hey, what you're doing is great, but we know we need to live the spirit of Kaizen. We need to get better. So we put together our vision and mission as a leadership team, and we got that blessed by our CIO. Our vision statement was to enhance our response to change and speed to market of product innovations through Agile development practices and culture. Our goals were to deliver value faster with higher quality, increase adaptability, increase consistency, create and sustain a culture of empowerment, transparency, openness, safety, and celebrating success. So this all sounds more like values and culture, right? We haven't started talking about practices yet. And then we had some milestones. We obviously had to align the vision and goals with our stakeholders. We wanted to do a baseline assessment of our current state of where we were, because we knew some Agile was going on and some of it was good. Then identify those gaps as a result of those assessments and create a roadmap to align those goals and help mitigate those identified gaps by grooming our backlog of what was the highest priority to work on. And then we would develop and execute on those, that mitigation of those gaps through iterative implementation. So I'll walk through that in a little more detail here. So this was our, this is a snapshot of how the assessments were done. I have to give credit to Linda Fahrenkopf. I don't think Linda is here today. She is with Pillar Technologies now. She was actually an independent consultant with us at the time, who helped us develop this assessment, and we broke it into 3 categories. We had management practices, which were really about the roles and the ceremonies that go along with Agile. That's in the gray. In the center, in the blue, were our culture practices. So it was really all about the values and the culture and how are those being demonstrated. And then the third were the engineering practices. So in our roadmap, based on where we were as an organization, what we decided to do is we had the coaches do the assessments of the culture with the teams, each of the standing teams, without the Scrum Masters in the room. And if a coach was the Scrum Master, they swapped with another coach. Dan Cook, who's sitting right here, was actually the other coach who was the independent consultant who worked with us as the other embedded coach for these teams. So Dan and Linda completed these assessments for the various teams, and they were done with the utmost of confidentiality. There was no information to be shared outside of the room except for the ratings based on those things and some general themes. But no individuals were to be called out or no quotes from the conversation were to be held because we wanted to make it psychologically safe. So those culture assessments happened throughout the first and second quarter. In the meantime, we set up teams to assess the different management practices. We started by sitting with all the Scrum Masters, and we had them do a fist of 5 rating on the level of maturity on the management practices for their teams. And then as we talked about each of their teams, then we did one overall rating organizationally as to how we felt we were doing. Once we knew how we rated with these practices, then we could basically groom our practice backlog and say, okay, so if we know that we're at a level 0 on this practice, then we need to put that in the first sprint that we're going to work to improve. And then at the bottom, you see the engineering practices. As an organization, we knew that there was going to be a new DevOps leader and a new QA practice leader, automation practice leader chosen. So we decided to defer those assessments until Q4 because we knew that we needed the support and collaboration with those groups. So this is what our roadmap looked like. So based on the rating of those fist of 5s, we established basically our sprints, and they were 2 to 3 months. It kind of varied based on what was going on in the organization and our peak times in our business. But the teams were formed. They were asked to work on certain practices. They would go and they would investigate the shoe, and they would also talk about what practices were working well across the different teams. And they would come back with a recommendation, which would be their show and tell in the form of an all-day session that would happen every other month. And they would sit down and walk through them with each team. After the first sprint, we recognized that we needed to stand up an adoption team that would take the recommendations from those different practices and start to figure out how they would be socialized, whether it would be direct training with individual teams, whether it would be assessing different teams and giving them recommendations, whether it would be training, lunch and learns, building out our SharePoint site with all of that information, those kinds of things. And the team of usually 4 or 5 people who were mainly Scrum Masters, but there was also a few representatives from the technical team. There were some folks from business analysis and from QA. They were accountable for figuring out how to drive that adoption for those practices that they had researched and make recommendations as to how we were going to improve them in our organization. So you can see we had 4 practices or 4 iterations of the management practices in 2017. The culture practices were completed right before the middle of the year, and then we identified some, basically some changes that needed to happen with some of the team members and the Scrum Masters as far as making them more capable and making the teams more psychologically safe, and those practices are continuing on today. The engineering practice assessment did occur at the end of the year, and I believe they are continuing to move forward with those as well. So I think I've covered most of that on there. And there's time for questions at the end as well. So that was my 2 case studies. But how do we pay it forward? What's next on the horizon? Well, I call it pay it forward, and I put the beautiful picture of the horizon here to say Agile does work in the not-for-profit world as well. And I have 2 examples to share with you about that. The first is higher education. So I was doing a presentation very similar to this for an IIBA conference in 2015 around SAFE. And someone approached me at the end of my presentation and said, if you ever want a job at Columbus State, you have one. And I said, well, I already have a job. And he began to start talking to me about the fact that they recognized that in their computer science program, there was a dire need to take the typical lecture and exam and quiz format that had been going on for 50 years and transform it into something that would enable the success of their graduates to go out and start working. The demand was definitely there. I mean, Columbus State is only a 2-year institution. You can only get an associate's degree there. But students were getting job offers, really good job offers, to be developers and work in networking and work as BAs and Scrum Masters, project managers, I should say, at the time, after only 2 years of education. And companies were saying, we'll pay for you to finish and get your bachelor's degree because the demand in Columbus is just so high, which is an awesome thing. So what we needed to do is we needed to get those students ready for the real world. We needed to create an environment for them so that they would know how they would be evaluated in the work world and how they would be successful in the work world. So I've had a lot of fun with this. This is our classroom, and Columbus State made huge investments to refactor several of their classrooms in the Workforce Innovation Building so that we actually have an agile environment. And it's just fascinating by just the space change, how from the very, very first class, all of the students are talking with each other, collaborating, and they're all best friends by the end of the 15-week semester. And it was funny, we took this picture specifically because when Facilities was building this classroom for us, and we said that we wanted, I think there's 9 whiteboards, or 8 whiteboards in the room, they said, you'll never use all those whiteboards. Every single whiteboard is used, every single week. Because what we do is we come in, we have them create their Scrum board, and it's based on the syllabus. So they're basically tracking throughout the class what work we're doing. And we do story card mapping. We do product backlog refinement. We play product owner games. We do the penny game. We do the marshmallow game, of course. And the class actually culminates at the end with a Scrum simulation that lasts 3 weeks. And it was actually designed by a professor in Brazil, but it's out on Tasty Cupcakes and available for anyone to use. And it uses the game Minecraft, the education edition of Minecraft, as the development tool. So that any student, regardless of whether they are a programming major, if they're a development major, or if they're just a project management BA major, they can participate in this simulation, where they have to build a structure. And as the instructor, I play the product owner. I give them the priority of the story cards. They have to build out the tasks. Someone plays the Scrum Master role, and everyone else plays the developer and QA roles, and they move forward, and they build out the structure over a 3-week period. The sprints happen over 45 minutes. They do a stand-up every 15 minutes for 3 minutes. So I'm really pushing them, and they always say, wow, this is really, really fast. How can we handle this? I said, well, this is the sustainable pace that you need to learn. Every single student tells me by the end of the simulation that the concepts are all brought together for them after they get through the simulation. Sitting there and understanding, we do play some games throughout the semester, but really living it for 3 weeks is what brings it together. They also have to do assessments on each other. They do team assessments. Now, they're not graded on how they're assessed or what their assessment score is. They're graded on the fact that they complete the assessments for each other, because we create that safe environment where they recognize that working in a team environment is the most important thing that they need to learn and to be marketable in the world. And I mean, typically, I think it's changing, but typically we have a lot of introverted individuals in the computer science major, and a lot of times it's very challenging for them to get up and talk in front of the group. But we create that safe environment for them to do that. And they learn and they grow without penalty. So we're very excited about this. Actually, we've even spun off another branch of this, known as workforce innovation. Workforce innovation is working with companies around the city to create programs where we can actually go onto their campus and do training very similar to this. Some large Fortune 100 companies have already entertained a couple of programs with us, and we've done a couple of different things, and it's mentioned here. The chair of Workforce Innovation put this together just so you could get a little more background on this as well. But I personally have been involved in an Agile requirements class that we built for a Fortune 100 company here in town. We did an 8-week course, which includes story mapping and story development in an Agile fashion, because there were a team of people that felt like they needed better education and learning about how to do Agile requirements. And the vice president there was very supportive. It's a great program for large companies because the employees can use their educational reimbursement if they have it. The cost for a not-for-profit company, for Columbus State, to provide this training to companies around the city is very economical compared to working with a for-profit institution. So we've taken a lot of the things that we do in the classroom and we test them with folks who are working out in the industry, and then we can do that Kaizen on both classes and improve it both on the for-credit side and the not-for-credit side. So it's very, very exciting stuff. And one more not-for-profit, CAS, which is my current home. How many people even know what CAS is or what they do? Okay, a few, but how many of you have lived in Columbus for more than 5 years? Many more of you, right? Don't feel bad, I feel the same way. The only thing I knew about CAS, formerly known as Chemical Abstracts, was the picnic with the pops that used to happen years ago on the lawn at Ackerman and Olentangy, right? Which is now at the waterfront, so we don't even get credit for that, although our president is trying to get it back there, so stay tuned. So CAS, and we do refer to ourselves as CAS now, like IBM, not CAS, it's CAS. We are a not-for-profit that has been calling Columbus home for over 110 years, believe it or not. We have the largest curated content of chemical information in the world. We have over 600 people within the walls of our building who have their doctorate degree, at least one PhD. Some have multiple. I have to catch myself a lot of times saying Mr. So-and-so, and I should be saying Dr. So-and-so. There are over 30 languages spoken within the walls, and many more, and people from that many countries and more. When you're walking through our cafeteria, it's very much like being in a big city, like walking through New York City or whatever, because the cultures, the languages, the diversity is just absolutely incredible. CAS has a big job in front of us. We've typically been a content publisher, and a lot of that was paper and encyclopedia type books and publications for many, many years. But we're migrating to become an information solution provider. So we have needs to move forward with a digital transformation and an agile transformation. One of the things that I found very, very inspiring in working for CAS is that CAS has either been directly or indirectly involved in every Nobel Prize in science ever awarded. So just think of all of the things that we've done to help further scientific discovery, cures for diseases. It's just incredible. I get goosebumps just thinking of all the things that we can do for the world. And 60% of our business is actually outside of the United States, believe it or not. So CAS's Agile Journey started about 2.5, 3 years ago. Is that about right, Bonnie? Got Bonnie out there in the audience. Bonnie spoke yesterday about psychological safety and did an awesome job. For those of you who were at her workshop, it was very well done. But the journey started about 2.5, 3 years ago. They have moved to a beautiful Agile space. We're just getting started. There's a thriving community of practice, a center of excellence as well, and there are certain parts of our technology group that are moving towards a safe portfolio. We're partnering at the enterprise PMO level to leverage some of those things and see how that we can grow that even further. I know Neil's in here. There's Neil. Neil and I were just talking about that last week. So we have a lot of exciting things going on at CAS, and we need talent like all of you to help make the journey happen and make the dream happen. Our goal is to enable safety because we are moving from more of a traditional culture, similar to to Grange Insurance, the company I talked about as my first case study. A lot of collaboration between business and technology has already happened, and it's continuing to improve. So those collaboration benefits are already there. We have our product owners sitting on the floor with us in technology, and they are loving it. So it's just been absolutely incredible. And believe it or not, our marketing department has transformed into an Agile organization as well. This recent blog was posted on LinkedIn by our Vice President of Marketing, Chris McHugh. And she writes, as the market evolves and pressure mounts to deliver new and better products and provide highly responsive support to ensure customer success, organizations must also grow and change to operate more efficiently, empower collaboration, and quickly adapt to change. So it's very exciting. Our transformation for Agile is way beyond technology. Our business folks recognize it and they embrace it. So in summary, a framework for success for your Agile transformation. Make sure you understand up front what's working. Find those bright spots, and I don't only mean practices, but people. So if you've read Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath, they talk about the bright spots. So take a read of that, or at least a summary of that information, and understand what the bright spots mean. It's basically finding things that are working really well in your organization with folks who are already advocates for it. That is very important, especially when you're in an organization with a lot of tenure, because those individuals have influence that you as a newcomer coming in as a coach will not have. So put them in the spotlight. Have them be the bright spots and figure out how you can leverage that. But make sure that you also become students of the principles and practices that have worked so well with all of the great leaders and the great minds in the Agile world. Make sure you focus on the shoe before you move to the ha and the re. Then, define your Agile, define your common nomenclature, make it work for your organization, and involve everyone in the journey. Create that community. Make sure people understand how they can communicate with one another, how they can share, reward that, celebrate that, promote that. And so, my fortune for you is that all of the tortoises in your life are well clothed and well sheltered. That is adorable, isn't it? So what questions can I answer for you? Yes, Mimi.
So you've been involved in various transformations, and what would you say is the most challenging? You talk about change, you talk about the importance of going, making sure from the start you're starting with the values, the mindset and the values. And so often we go to practices first, which I think is problematic, but what do you think are the toughest challenges to fix?
Okay, so the question is, what are the toughest challenges to face with a transformation? Obviously, I'll say the most important challenges to face. Maybe if I can reframe it that way a little bit. You have to make sure you have that top-down support, and it can't just be an IT for IT thing, right? It's got to be supported by your business. They have to see the value of it. So getting those advocates, one of the most important things we did with the Grange training program is that we had product managers from the business lines kicking off all of those training programs and talking about why it was important that we needed to move towards Agile practices, and talking about some of the bottom line, the P&L opportunities that they were seeing in their product mix as a result of moving to an Agile framework. So you have to have that support, because what will happen invariably is people will struggle because personal change is hard. They will push back. They will be concerned about the changes they're dealing with. And you need to equip the leaders to understand that this change is going to cause some concern, some unrest, but they need to be equipped with those talking points and that information to help guide forward and then allow you to do your job and continue to move the team forward. I think other challenges are around, maybe this is becoming less prevalent, but I know in the early years it was, people didn't really understand what Agile was. It was kind of like no rules, no boundaries, right? Whereas we know now that Agile is even more prescriptive than waterfall in a way, because information and progress becomes so much more visible, so much more quickly. So it is a discipline. It's just a different kind of discipline. It does evolve, and we do Kaizen, and we need to make sure that it works for the situation, but there is still a discipline that needs to be maintained in order to be successful with Agile. Yeah?
Do you have some tips for program management and project management if you're working with Agile teams? Because you're still going to have large projects and programs that are not all about developing software. There's overlay on top of it. What are some tips on working with various Agile teams?
So the question is, what are some tips on program and project management, which is still going to exist in organizations and most often very waterfall-like, right? Because of a need to be reporting that way. I actually talk about that in my class. I spend a couple of weeks teaching the students waterfall and traditional project management and how a traditional PMO needs to report on information, because most places we're going to walk into are going to be some combination, right? They're going to be some sort of hybrid model by design. And even if your technology department is completely agile and you've got good business sponsorship, the executive suite may not think that way. They want monthly status, they want monthly variances on your on your budget and schedule and everything else. So there are some scaling agile practices and frameworks that obviously have become very prevalent. SAFe is the one I'm most familiar with. And to boil it all down, I think what those practices try to do is they try to say, create some alignment in the planning process, whether the organization is agile, waterfall, or somewhere in between, so that you have regular planning increments. And I think SAFe recommends that they are quarterly, where you're getting a group of people together and you're aligning on what are the key value streams that you need to deliver on, what are the key features, and whether those features end up being delivered in a waterfall or an agile fashion or somewhere in between. The team comes together on those regular increments and does kind of these Uber show and tells and Uber planning sessions to make sure that that alignment exists. Because as you know, there are going to be certain organizations that are going to struggle with Agile. One of the classes I just taught at this Fortune 100 company had a lot of folks from the data organization, and they're always the ones that really struggle with Agile, right? Because they see it as looking through a pinhole to build a data model, and that they can't do that. So recognizing that just because you're Agile doesn't mean you don't plan. You still do iteration 0. You still do a very robust iteration 0. Actually, that was with the company that had those iterations of key practices. Iteration 0 was the highest prioritized need by that group to figure out how they could get alignment with upper leadership and have a plan that moved beyond 2 weeks. Many teams were really just thinking about their delivery in terms of 2 weeks because that's what they thought they needed to do, when in fact they never understood what their ultimate goal was, and it wasn't aligned to the key features of the product they were trying to deliver. Does that help? Yeah.
You talk a lot about the culture type things as far as around Agile. Can you talk a little bit about maybe in the past where you've seen successful implementations where majority, 60-70% of the team is offshore, different time zone? The only contact that you would have with them is, say, in the early morning for an initial stand-up for 15 minutes, so no real relationships with the people offshore, no real involvement or engagement or anything, but yet still trying to, have a cohesive team.
Mm-hmm. Well, offshore is definitely a challenge. The question is, how do you make it work successfully with the culture in an offshore team? I probably don't have a silver bullet for you. I've seen, back when I worked at Nationwide, we had an individual who, and this was just kind of a serendipity, he was from India, and he had family back in the city where our offshore team was. So he would spend half his time in Dublin, Ohio, and half his time in India. So he got to know all of the team members, and he was sort of that link between the two cultures to help grow that. So obviously you did do the video calls every morning, and you did the stand-ups that way, and you had to use a tool that had visual boards so that everybody could be updating and keeping that current. Collaboration tools that exist, Slack and those kinds of things, whatever you can do to enable more collaboration between those teams remotely with technology always helps. But but yeah, it's definitely a chasm when you've got people from that distance. You've got to make sure you stay diligent with those ceremonies and keep those ceremonies going as much the same as if they were on site. And obviously you're going to have time barriers and language barriers, but you do the best you can. And whenever you can have a conduit to both sides, that's really ideal. Does anybody else in the audience have an example maybe? Because I honestly haven't worked with a lot of offshore teams, so maybe someone in the audience has and can share some insight. Dan Cook?
Yeah. Think of it, if you were just in one time zone, Cindy mentioned that management had to be aligned with the transformation. I would say the same thing for multiple time zones. The people are the shadow of the leaders. As long as management in both areas are aligned and are working towards the same goal, then the transformation has a better chance of succeeding. If there are competing priorities based on where people are located and those are not aligned, then it may be a formula that handicaps the transformation. And that would be one way of the starting point. Getting, again, back to the mindset, getting away from the practices, getting away from metrics, getting away from the control of the teams. As long as people see that management is supporting them, going for the lean pillars, respecting, doing improvements, it goes a long way in trying to be successful.
Yeah.
Other thoughts or questions?
Another, a couple over the motor insurance, a couple of tactics that we've used were, as was mentioned, the early morning, since we offshore to India a lot. So one of the things a couple of things we tried were, as was mentioned a little earlier, just the early morning hours such that at least we were able to talk real time then. And we also use video. We have we would, sometimes the folks there would just video, some of their stand-ups of what was going on there. And we could see them when we came in the morning, that kind of thing. So any technology that was available, we use any place that technology was available, plus that overlap of their evening hours and our early morning hours.
Thank you.
I would just say we're at Grange, we're not very far with utilizing offshore resources as much, but I would just say that people are still people. So as you're bringing together a team, those team experiences. So we've done some things like trying to make sure we have not just the video conferencing, but pictures on the wall that represent the people that we can't always see every day. We've done some things like celebrating different holidays together that recognize the differences in the group. So that those kinds of things help to build relationships that increase our ability to be better teams.
That's really awesome feedback. Building that community, right? And respecting people. Right. Grange is an awesome culture for that. Yes?
A question, Cindy.
Yes.
I'm from Honda. I like what your comment is that to get the Agile transformation, you have to also get the business side, the top management support.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that part and how in the past you get that support?
Yeah, that's a great point. Getting top-down management support is very, very important. There were a lot of things I had to take out of this presentation to keep it to the time frame. In a company I worked for even prior to Grange, and actually a similar thing we did with Grange, we partnered with Forrester, and we partnered with Michigan State at Grange, but when I was at Nationwide, we partnered with Forrester and actually did a study to value where they do their TEI, or total economic impact. You can actually still find this white paper. It doesn't mention Nationwide, but it's from about 2004, and it's called something like the total economic impact of Agile methodology, or something to that nature, where we had the benefit of working with a company called ThoughtWorks, and we had two parallel projects that were delivering very much the same thing. Now, you could argue, why would you keep both of them going? But regardless, they were still going because they were funded by separate business units. So what we were able to do is we allowed one to continue on a waterfall path, and then we had the other one go on an agile path. And as a result of that, we were able to quantify the fact that we were able to add 26 additional features to the final product on the Agile project. We were able to deliver 80% fast, in 80% of the time. All of this stuff is in that white paper in our partnership with ThoughtWorks and Forrester. So any way that you can try to bring that value statement to our business partners is important. I think that's maybe less of an issue now, because like I said, this was back in 2004 where business partners and leaders didn't know what Agile was, they had never heard of it. Now they're kind of clamoring for it, but they just don't really, sometimes they don't really know what they're asking for, or they don't know what change is involved or what they're going to have to do to support to make it successful. So if you've got their support, or at least you've piqued their interest, then you have to start educating them on what kind of commitment they need to make and the organization will need to make to change, and equip them with those talking points and that information to make it happen. I believe it's version 1 who does the State of Agile survey every year, and they also show, it's a very interesting comparison between what leaders think they're going to get out of an Agile transformation and what they actually get after they've been working through it for a couple of years. It's fascinating because they think, obviously, what do you think that they think the first thing they're going to get is? Time to market, cost less, right? But the first things they really get are improved collaboration, improved quality, higher value delivered sooner, right? Which actually is what you want with an Agile transformation. So helping to educate them on, okay, this is what you might think you're going to get initially, but this is how the evolution will happen. And also being very honest with them about how long an Agile transformation takes. I was actually walking through that with our president at CAS recently and showed the maturity model of various things, Agile being one of them, and I showed that it would be 2 to 3 years before we really were doing certain practices in an Agile fashion. He did look at me and he said, well, that's really honest. But I didn't want him to think that because I had a 2018 roadmap that I was going to get everything done in a year. Because personal change is hard, and culture change is hard, and it takes time. So I was level setting with him right up front. You've got to be in this for the long haul. And I'm not saying that I'm not going to get you some quick wins. So you look for those quick wins when you can, because that keeps them interested, right? But make sure they recognize they're committed to the long haul. Does that help?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Could I have a chance for a follow-up on that?
Sure.
Okay, so here's the case. We are running some Agile training. Some of the business middle-level people coming to the training. They're doubtful. Says, how this is going to work? How this is going to help me to get the budget approved? And how this going to guarantee IT side? And in the past, you have not delivered, and this is really going to deliver. And now you're putting me on this product owner role, and I'm going to carry a lot of weight here. So those words are going to come back, going back to their management. And now, how about this scenario? So we got a chance to sit down with their management, division manager, for example. And what would you have the elevator speech, like to open up? You get 5 minutes chance to get the guy's attention. What would you say to him?
So this person is senior leader?
Yes.
So the elevator speech. Well, I have a bunch of thoughts going through my head because you talked about the product owner role too. And before I go to the elevator speech, back to Mimi's question, that's another big challenge with transformations if you don't have that product owner support and that commitment. And you need to hit them between the eyes with what that is and spend a lot of time educating the product owners on what they're going to do. Even maybe create a separate job description or a role if you can in the organization. The second company I talked about was actually doing that and building that product owner responsibility into objectives. But as far as the elevator speech, I would probably speak at a higher level with the executives because they're going to be thinking about delivering value and creating more revenue generating opportunities for their organization. So I might be talking more from the safe perspective with them and just saying, have you identified what your core strategic value streams are for this year? And have you figured out the best way to deliver that value as frequently and as soon as possible to meet your goals? And they'll probably say, I'm open to suggestions, right? And then I'll say, well, let me talk to you a little bit about how we can set up an Agile portfolio and start standing up Agile release trains and building that out. Because obviously at that highest level, they're going to be looking at those core strategic deliverables that they want to achieve on their roadmap.
Thank you, Cindy.
Yeah. Neil, I think you were next.
Yeah. Questions related to maybe some of the practices, like management team, engineering practices.
Yes.
So sometimes with an agile transformation, I've seen people struggle with the transformation, like maybe they feel like they're giving up control. You might have a software development manager that's been doing it for years, right? And you kind of go into this more likely approach matrix management. And just any thoughts on how you experience kind of coaching folks through that?
Absolutely. My favorite book and my favorite author of all time, Management 3.0, Jürgen Appello. So Mimi and Angela and I, when we were at Grange, went through the training, and Jürgen was actually here in the States. There are so many techniques, games, ceremonies, practices that you can use to help get that manager to make that leap from management 1.0, which is the command and control. What we learn in business school is the theory X, top down, do as I say as I do mentality, past management 2.0, which is flavor of the month. Yeah, we're agile. We got the furniture. Go. You're done. I'm done. You let me know if you need anything. But I gave you the money. I gave you the furniture. You guys can have your stand-ups. I'll bring you the food, the pizza parties. You got the 2 pizza teams. Here's your pizza. That's management 2.0. Management 3.0 is when managers pivot from being in a supervisory capacity and being in a servant leader capacity, right? So what you have to do is you have to make sure that they recognize that it is even more important as a leader in a management 3.0 world than it is from management 1.0 world, because they have to become a coach and an advocate. So no, they're not making decisions about day-to-day stuff, because the law of requisite variety tells us that the best way to make the best decisions for a team day-to-day is to push that decision down as far as possible to the people who are doing it. Because there is no manager with any brain capacity or any experience who could possibly make all the right decisions every single time. So when you push that decision-making down to the day-to-day things, it becomes a challenge, and a very good challenge, for that leader to figure out how to establish those guardrails and those goals in a way that the team can make decisions every day. What are those problem statements that project team needs to solve for every day? And how can they decision around them as they're talking through story cards and requirements with their product owner? If a new leader can do that and be a coach and an advocate and a sponsor and build morale, they're going to be unstoppable. The ultimate leader works themselves out of a job. They have to bring people around them that are at least as smart as they are, but at least, usually more smart than they are. So you have to let go of the ego, and you have to let the team succeed. And that's the true definition of a leader. And I could talk for another hour about leadership, but Management 3.0 is an excellent book. Yes?
First of all, great presentation.
Thank you.
I work in the healthcare industry, specifically hospital, multi-system, multi-hospital systems, and we are trying to manage an electronic health record, which obviously is highly regulated, highly complex. And so as an IT manager, as trying to do some agile principles, class management principles, what I run into is my customers are physicians, pharmacists, nurses. They're inaccessible. Have you seen or been part of or heard of a good approach to work with a healthcare system and managing an electronic health record in an agile environment?
Well, I have definitely worked in a lot of highly regulated environments. I mean, insurance and aviation are pretty highly regulated as well. In our current organization with CAS, we have definitely are very, very intelligent scientists who are very structured in the way they do things, and MVP becomes a really big challenge, right? Because they think it's all or nothing. They have to get everything done perfectly or not at all. getting the time commitment, you know, I think it spins back to that sponsorship at the leadership level, that if you really want to move forward with an agile transformation, the product owner so determines the success of the team. It determines the culture of that team. It determines the morale of that team. And it ultimately determines the success of that team. Choosing those roles is paramount to a successful agile transformation. It's absolutely paramount. Some of the last things I did before I left NetJets is we had our leader who sat on the senior leadership team in technology, CIO reported up through him. He was going to the business sponsors and the functional areas and saying, you need to fund product owner training. You need to support 2 days of training for them off-site to get their certified product owner and the Scrum product owner, and then being a part of a quarterly community where they're giving X number of hours every quarter to enhancing their craft. And because otherwise, I mean, you can't blame technology if we don't deliver for you what you need. You have to come to the party too. You have to be a part of that. There are some ways to get creative with the fact that you have, if you have a product owner who's in a position who just can't possibly be co-located with you every day, who else in that organization can serve as their proxy? It gets dangerous sometimes if they're only skilled in one aspect of that person's domain, or they're not empowered to make daily decisions on behalf of that person. But if and when you can find that, that works well also. And I bet there's other ideas in the room as well, because we've got a lot of smart Agilists here. Are there any other examples of experiences where you guys have faced that and conquered it? Yes?
I worked at one of the healthcare management organizations, and I also worked with the junior hospital systems in town. And I was the hybrid role of data science master. And we worked with several different positions and exactly stating what Cindy is alluding to. You need to have the buy-in, and we need to have a good product owner. So our CIO had taken on role upon himself that he met with the physicians and the steering committee once a month or twice a month, and then they had all the requirements, and they determined the priority of the requirements. And if we could not have a physician come to our stand-ups, we had, as Cindy saying, we had one of their designated people. And then they took back all our information. But the thing is, once some of the physicians started actually listening and coming to our stand-ups, they were amazed. They were amazed how much work IT was doing. And they actually understood. And they said, we are all with you now. We know how much stuff that you're working hard at. So it is possible. And actually, you would have really good buy-in. They love Agile because the thing is, they love visual goals. They love to see and track how much progress teams are making. So I think getting a buyout from, and then getting some product owner training, as she said, it's really, really critical.
And you do that in the healthcare industry, didn't you, Bindu? Was that your Ohio Health experience? Yes. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Bindu.
One of the things they're doing here at OSU and OSU Medical is even having their pairing such that it's kind of interesting with product owners. They're pairing the physicians, and so that when one's not there, the other one's there. And they're also doing, doing things by phone. They're, as you said, their schedules are just crazy and unpredictable. So that was how their tactics went.
We had some physicians who were so excited, they gave me their cell phone number and said, call me, or I have my nurse call me if I'm not in surgery, and I want to be part of the thing. So,
wow.
So there's some really good people out there who are in it. You need the executive leadership and the buy-in.
Absolutely.
Those are your champions. So look for some champions.
Well, we're about at time. Thank you all for being such a great audience and for helping to participate in some of the Q&A. As I mentioned, this is my email address at CAS. This is also my LinkedIn. I'd be more than happy to talk with you about your challenges with your Agile transformation. I do a little bit of transformation consulting on the side, as I do with Columbus State as well. So thank you so much, and I'll see you out there.